You're born in 1350, somewhere in the English countryside. Congratulations, you've got about a 50% chance of making it past age 5. And if you do, absolutely nobody is going to hand you a phone, a curfew, or a single moment of what you'd recognize as being a teenager. That concept doesn't exist yet, not even close. You spend your early childhood doing small chores, fetching water, minding chickens, learning which plants in the hedge won't poison you. Life is hard but manageable, mostly because expectations are low and supervision is constant. Then you turn 12 and everything changes overnight. Because in medieval Europe, 12 isn't the awkward middle of childhood. It's basically the front door to adulthood, and someone's about to shove you through it. Let's go over the perks of this real quick so you don't start crying just yet. 1. You get taken seriously earlier than kids today ever will. 12-year-old, you can testify in certain church courts, and by 14, you can legally be considered an adult for a whole range of purposes, including marriage in some cases. 2, you skip the whole agonizing wait to start your career, because apprenticeships and adult labor start now, not after 4 more years of forced boredom in a classroom. 3, nobody's going to lecture you about finding yourself, because medieval society has already found you a job, a role, and usually a spouse, often before you've finished growing. Here's the catch. All of that responsibility lands on you at once with zero transition period while your body is still finishing puberty and your brain, though nobody in 1350 has any concept of neuroscience, is nowhere near done developing. You don't get a gap year. You get gap none. And that's assuming your teenage years go relatively normally, because for some boys your age, especially near coastlines or contested borders, normal isn't even on the table. We'll get to that. You show up to your new adult-shaped life thinking it's going to be simple. Learn a trade, help the family, grow up eventually. Right? Wrong. First thing you learn, if you're a boy from a family with any kind of trade connections, you're getting shipped off, sometimes literally out of your own village, to live with a master craftsman as an apprentice. Not a mentor who checks in occasionally. A legal guardian who now controls your food, your lodging, your discipline, and your entire daily schedule for the next 7 years. You don't get to pick your master. Your family picks for you, usually based on connections and a fee they can barely afford. And once the contract's signed, you're stuck, whether he turns out to be a patient teacher or a miserable tyrant who beats apprentices for burning the bread. If you're a girl, your path looks different, but easier is not the word for it. You're trained hard in household management, starting shockingly young, brewing, spinning, dairy work, childcare, all treated as serious labor because it is. And somewhere in your early to mid-teens, marriage negotiations start, sometimes involving you directly, sometimes happening entirely over your head between your father and whichever family wants an alliance, a dowry deal, or an extra pair of working hands. Consent, as a concept you get meaningfully asked about, is patchy at best, depending on your family, your class, and frankly your luck. Then come the rules. Oh, the rules! You're drilled on obedience, like your entire future depends on it, because it kind of does. Rule number 1, respect your master or your husband's household without question, because open defiance can get you legally beaten, disowned, or both, and courts of the era generally back the authority figure, not the teenager. Rule number 2, your reputation, especially if you're a girl, is treated as fragile and easily ruined, one rumor away from disaster, which means your freedom of movement gets restricted in ways your little brother never has to think about. Chaperones, curfews, whispered gossip that can end a marriage prospect before it even starts. Rule number 3, work comes before everything, including sleep, because idle hands are considered a moral failure in a world that genuinely believes the devil finds work for them, and a master who catches you daydreaming is well within his rights to remind you of that with a switch. But that's just the beginner stuff. After a couple of years, things get serious. If you're an apprentice, you're now doing real dangerous labor, blacksmithing near open flame, working with sharp tools that have already taken fingers off boys older and more experienced than you, or hauling loads that strain a body that, again, is still growing. Injuries are common. Medical care is a coin flip between a competent healer and someone who thinks bloodletting fixes everything, including the burn you just got from a forge. Your first real crisis hits during your second year away from home. Your master's in a foul mood. Business is bad, and he takes it out on his apprentices, you included, with a beating that leaves you limping for a week. You have no one to complain to. Running away breaks a binding legal contract your own family signed, and getting caught means being dragged back in disgrace, or worse, being branded unreliable, which follows you for life in a world where reputation is basically your only currency. So you do what almost every apprentice in your position does. You grit your teeth, you keep working, and you quietly count down the years. Now, here's that darker path we mentioned earlier, the one some boys your age don't get to avoid. If you'd been born in a coastal village instead, or somewhere along a contested border, your teenage years could have taken a far worse turn. Raids, whether Viking coastal attacks in earlier centuries or the ongoing Mediterranean slave trade that persisted well into the medieval period, regularly targeted the young specifically because teenage boys were considered strong enough to be useful and young enough to be reshaped into obedient labor. Captured boys got marched or shipped to slave markets, sold away from every person and place they'd ever known, and put to work as galley labor, farm labor, or household servitude, with no legal status, no family to appeal to, and no path back. Historical records from this trade also make clear that captive teenagers, stripped of any legal protection or family standing, were left vulnerable to sexual abuse by captors and owners, a grim and well-documented reality of medieval slavery that historians don't shy away from when discussing how these markets actually functioned. Unlike an apprentice's 7-year contract, there's no set end date on this. Freedom, if it ever comes, depends entirely on ransom, escape, or an owner's whim. Meanwhile, back home, your sister's situation escalates in its own brutal direction. Her marriage negotiations finalize, and at 15, she's married off to a man 12 years older, someone she's met maybe twice. The whole arrangement settled over a negotiation about land, livestock, and a dowry her father spent years scraping together. Within a year, she's pregnant, and here's the part that should make anyone watching this deeply grateful for modern medicine. Childbirth in this era kills a shocking number of young mothers, their bodies not always fully finished growing themselves, in a time with no understanding of infection, no reliable pain relief, and midwives doing genuinely heroic work with genuinely limited tools. Tools that sometimes amount to little more than clean linen, herbs, and experience passed down by word of mouth. Your sister survives. Plenty of girls her age don't. And everyone in the village quietly knows at least one family who buried a daughter and a grandchild in the same week. Somewhere in the middle of all this, you learn the one skill nobody officially teaches you: endurance without complaint. You watch friends your age die from injuries, from childbirth, from plague outbreaks that sweep through with terrifying speed and zero warning, killing young and old with equal indifference. You learn to keep functioning through grief because the alternative, falling apart, isn't really an option when the household still needs you working tomorrow morning. Years pass. If you're the apprentice, you eventually finish your contract, becoming a journeyman. Then maybe, if you're skilled and lucky, a master craftsman yourself with apprentices of your own to boss around, which feels like a strange kind of poetic justice after everything you went through. If you're the sister, you're now running your own household, raising children of your own, having somehow become a fully established adult, while people in later centuries would still be calling someone your age a kid. Here's the twist. The whole premise of being a teenager in medieval times sucking is actually built on a hidden assumption that doesn't hold up because medieval Europe didn't really have teenagers, not as a distinct life stage the way we understand it today. The very concept of adolescence, a recognized, protected, in between phase of life with its own culture, its own rights, its own expectation of gradual, gentle growth into adulthood, is a remarkably modern invention, largely developed and popularized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tied to things like mandatory schooling laws and changing labor economies that didn't exist yet in 1350. Medieval society didn't see 12 to 19-year-olds as a special category needing extra patience. It saw them as small adults, expected to work like adults, marry like adults, and suffer consequences like adults, the moment their bodies were physically capable of it. So, it's not quite accurate to say medieval teenagers had it worse than teenagers today, because in a very real sense, medieval teenagers didn't exist at all. What existed instead was an incredibly compressed, unforgiving version of growing up, where childhood ended abruptly around age 7 or so, and full adult responsibility arrived by 12 to 14, with nothing resembling a buffer zone in between. There was no phase where society expected you to be moody, uncertain, or still figuring out who you were, because nobody had the luxury of waiting around for you to figure it out. You weren't a teenager figuring yourself out, you were just a very young adult, thrown headfirst into apprenticeships, marriages, and mortality risks that modern teenagers, whatever their actual struggles are, will never have to face at 13. The real horror story here isn't that medieval teens had a rough version of adolescence. It's that adolescence, as a protected concept, simply hadn't been invented yet, and everyone paid the price for that gap, whether they were ready or not.